Grace, it is good to be with you this weekend. If I haven't had a chance to meet you, my name is Jeremy, and I get the privilege of serving as a campus pastor at Grace Fellowship Jefferson. And if you're just joining us, we are wrapping up a conversation that we started a number of weeks ago where we are looking at letters that are written to ancient churches. And these churches were churches that struggled, churches that succeeded. And we have an intent and a hope that we have for why we're looking at these letters. And the hope and the reason for this series is actually the first fill in the blank in your program. So I invite you to write this down, whether you're with us in person or online. The first thing that we need to recognize, the why behind the series, is that we want to aim our church or aim us towards faithfulness and warn us away from faithlessness. We recognize that these letters were not written to us, but that doesn't mean that they were not written for us and for our benefit. And our hope in looking at these letters is that we would be able to see the faithfulness that some of these Christians and churches demonstrated and learn to apply it to our life, while at the same time looking at the faithlessness that these churches and Christians individually and collectively demonstrated that we could avoid, that we could move ourselves away from. And our hope being that in learning from these churches and their context, we can learn how to more closely and faithfully walk with Jesus in our context. A number of years ago, my oldest daughter, Elaine, had gotten in her mind that she was a swimmer. She loved being in the water, and she would went around telling people over and over again, I'm a swimmer, I'm good at swimming, I love swimming. And me and my wife looked at each other and were thinking, girl, like, you haven't even had a swimming lesson yet. And so we signed her up for some swimming lessons, and it was a controlled environment, and she went through the swimming lessons, and she just kept on telling them, I'm a swimmer, I'm good at swimming, I love swimming, I'm good at swimming. And so one day we were going with Nana and Papa, that's Grandma and Grandpa in our family. We went to the pool, and she went to the deep end of the pool, and she said, Nana, Papa, watch this, and jumped off into the deep end. She thought she was swimming. What she was really doing was heading to an early grave. And as a good parent, I did what every good parent did, is I went in after her. And as I go into the water to grab her and to pull her out of the water, she was convinced that she was an Olympic level athlete because she was waving my arms away while choking down the water that was going to kill her. I'm okay, Dad, I'm good. I don't need your help. I'm a good swimmer. I can do this. I don't need your help. And while it's easy to see this in a child when they do something foolish like that, the reality is this isn't a childish thing. This actually is a people thing. And we as adults have much more sophisticated ways that we demonstrate this same characteristic in our life. I put it in your program notes this way, that in many ways, self-deception is inevitable when we buy into our own self-promotion. Self-deception is inevitable when we buy into our own self-promotion. We've seen this in the coworker who's so convinced that they're a genius, and that if upper management would simply listen to their ideas, turnover would go away, employee retention would increase, people would be happy, productivity would skyrocket, and everything in the company would be perfect. Now, we all know that no one even wants to listen to this person, let alone listen to their ideas. But they're so convinced that they're a genius and that they are a gift to the company, that they're incapable of hearing any form of feedback that would actually make their ideas more likely to be implemented. We've seen this in a spouse, not your spouse, but in other spouses, right? That they are so convinced that they are a catch, that even when there's great feedback, there's great ideas on how they can love their partner better or love their family better, that they are incapable of even perceiving the reality of those pieces of feedback because they recognize that their partner is so lucky to have them in their life. We see this in parents, not you as a parent, but in other parents. Right? They're so convinced and so impressed by their own parenting that they're incapable of understanding and seeing the dysfunction that exists underneath their roof and is manifesting in their perfect little Johnny. Incapable of seeing it. And while it's easy to see the deception in other people, the reality about self-deception is that it's far easier to see it in them than it is to see it in us. It's easier to see deception through the window and harder to see self-deception in the mirror. It's the proverbial sliver in their eye that we are very well aware of and the plank in our eye that we fail to grasp and see. Sociologists call this the Dunning-Kruger Effect. And what that really is that you and I have a tendency to be overestimate and be over-impressed by our own ability to be intelligent and smart. This shows up in lots of ways, but one of the best studies about this shows that the majority of Americans think they're smarter and better than the majority of Americans. I'm not a mathematician, but what I do know about math is that a majority can't be bigger than a majority. That's not how reality works. And one of the areas that the Dunning-Kruger Effect demonstrates and shows up with kind of blinding neon lights is in our wallet. That the larger our wallet becomes, the bigger our head becomes. And studies have shown over and over again that the bigger our bank account becomes, the more we are convinced that we are smarter and more intelligent than the rest of the people around us. In many ways, what this reveals and shows is that the wealthier we become, the more prosperous we become, the more susceptible we are to self-deception. Which means as Americans, we should be especially aware of this reality. Because in the grand scheme of things in the universe, we as Americans sit in the top 10% of the 7 billion people that exist on planet Earth. Which means that we as Americans, out of all the 7 billion people that are currently walking and breathing on planet Earth, are way more likely to be self-deceived than anybody else walking on the planet. There's an author that I love named Charles Duhigg, and he studies things like this. And one of the things that he noticed about this is when he was interacting with his peers, people who had graduated at the top of Ivy League schools and were working at top corporate jobs and working in government jobs and were incredibly successful, is he noticed this trend that the more successful these people became, people that he loved and worked with, the more miserable they became. Because in many ways what was happening is as they were buying into the self-deception, it was revealing and covering things that were in their life. And what he noticed was this, and I encourage you to write this down, was that material prosperity often hides spiritual poverty. Material prosperity often hides spiritual poverty. We've seen this oftentimes in the business person who is incredibly successful, that's climbing the corporate ladder, and they medicate the stress that comes from their success with an affair, and they send their family down the toilet. We've seen it in that other couple that we're friends with, or maybe that's in our neighborhood, and they are leveraging their financial future, and they're leveraging their finances in such a way that they are living on such high levels of stress because they have to have the newest, nicest, shiniest toy that's in their life. And they get that toy, and they leverage their finances, and they get to a place where the buzz from that purchase wears off, and they start planning the next purchase. We've seen this in the story after story of people who've won the lottery, who become instant millionaires overnight, and years later, sometimes not even years later, months later, they say something along the lines of this: I wish it had never happened to me. What they're recognizing in those moments is that they had material prosperity that was covering up spiritual poverty. But it wasn't just spiritual poverty. It was emotional poverty. It was relational poverty, psychological poverty. And that the pursuit and satisfaction that came from acquiring material prosperity allowed them to intentionally become ignorant in the spiritual realities of their life. It was easier to look away from what was going on inside them because what was going on outside them seemed to be incredibly impressive and powerful and satisfying. And so they ended up in a spot where they started to harm their own well-being because they had self-deceived themselves into thinking that they were just fine. And I say all this to unpack the letter that we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at the church of Laodicea. And what's really important for us to understand about the church of Laodicea is they were incredibly successful. And we're going to unpack more of this in a minute. But why we need to pay attention to this is because the context of what the Christians in Laodicea experience is probably one of the most similar contexts to what we experience as Christians here in the United States. That their level of material prosperity was covering up some spiritual poverty in their life. And for many ways, for you and for me, this is one of the biggest dangers that we need to be aware of if we call ourselves followers of Jesus. And if you're not a Christian, I think what you're going to notice that in this story and in this letter, there is nothing good to be said about this church. If you go back a couple of weeks, Pastor Keith was talking about this kind of fork in the road that happens in every follower of Jesus' life, in every church's life, where they come to a place where they allow themselves to become divorced and segregated from the heart of God, that their heart and God's heart take different roads, and they start heading off in different directions. And when that happens, it eventually produces and leads Christians and churches to a place of either spiritual death or spiritual dysfunction. And in many ways, the dysfunction of the churches that follow the church of Ephesus seem to be becoming more and more and more depraved over time. Last week, we had the culmination of a city that was celebrated for all the good that they had done, with nothing unfaithful to call out. And the church that we're going to look at today with Laodicea is the exact opposite. There's nothing good to say about this church. And if you're not a Christian, what you're going to see about this is that the thing that probably makes you most wary about organized religion are Christians that claim the name of Christ and are comfortable consuming religious experiences, but whose heart and life is unmoved by the ways and teaching of Jesus. It makes you wary and suspicious of organized religion. And if that's you, you're in good company. Because what you're going to see is that you're directly in the company of Jesus when it comes to the church of Laodicea. So I invite you, if you have a Bible, to turn to Revelation chapter 3. If you have a digital Bible, turn on. If you don't have a Bible across all of our different locations, I would love to have you stop by Grace Central after service. We would love to give you a Bible to say thank you for being a part of service, so that if you choose to join us again, you can read along with us as we do our studies each week here at Grace. So here we are, Revelation chapter 3, and he starts off right here. To the angel of the church in Laodicea, write this: these are the words of the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the ruler of God's creation. This is a way of saying these are the direct words of Jesus. If you understand what's going on here, John, the Apostle John, is receiving a message directly from Jesus, and he's writing down and transcribing the words of Jesus to these churches. And so this is a poetic way of writing to this church. And what we need to understand is the specific context. Rather than go through the whole passage and take each interesting fact at a time, I want to unpack the context for us. Because what we need to understand is that this letter, like all the letters in the book of Revelation, are written to churches in a particular context. And if we understand the particular context that this church existed and how they operated, it will allow us to actually mine from this letter helpful and hopeful truths that we can apply to our life in a more helpful and accurate way. And if we fail to understand the context, we will fail to see the truth that Jesus has intentionally preserved in this letter over the last 2,000 years for churches like Grace. And so there's a number of things happening. One of the first things that's important to call out is the church of Laodicea didn't have its own water source. And so they had this elaborate network of aqueducts that would pump in water from different cities. In Hierapolis, they had a warm spring and a hot spring that would produce and pump hot water, and they would send that to Laodicea. And then you had Colossae that had a cold spring that would send cold, refreshing water. And the hot water was often used for comfort and for healing and medicinal purposes. The cold water was used for cooking and satisfaction and refreshment. And they would kind of get pushed together all at once. And what would happen oftentimes in this context is when the water would come together, the cold water and the hot water, and it would sit and become stagnant. The minerals that existed in this water would calcify. And the calcification process that once ingested would actually make you violently sick. Like you couldn't hold anything in. Everything that came in would come right back out. Disgusting, gross, vile. There's also a number of other things economically that were important to understand. The city of Laodicea was incredibly successful financially. They had a banking system that was regionally well known. Everyone who lived in Laodicea was incredibly wealthy compared to the surrounding communities and surrounding cities. Their banking system was world class. And part of the reason why that was the case is because they had a medical school. The medical school was world renowned because they created treatments and salves and medicine that would help treat stigmatisms and other issues of health that came to people's eyes. They also had this wool that was very predominant in the sheep in the area that allowed them to create these dark garments that were easy to dye, dark, rich colors that people from around the world would pay top dollar for because it was trendy and fashionable. And so again, as I say this, hopefully we're starting to see the connection that existed in our cultural context with their cultural context. And what's just a beauty about the genius of Jesus in this is what you will see is Jesus is hitting all of these important historical realities to help them understand the truth of what he's trying to communicate to them. So he writing to them, and this is what he has to say starting in verse 15. He says, I know your deeds. I know how you live, Christians, that you are neither hot nor cold. I wish that you were either one or the other. So because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I'm about to spit you out of my mouth. That's the nice church version of saying, I'm going to projectile vomit you out of my mouth. Because what I am witnessing about your faith and how you're conducting yourself, I find disgusting and sick. I think it's important for us to talk about this for a moment. Because depending on the way that you were raised, in the church context that you had growing up, you may have grown up in a more conservative culture or even maybe more of a fundamentalist church culture. And in those church cultures, often there's a misrepresentation of what this passage is all about. And it would go something like this. This is the way that I was raised. This is what I heard, maybe what many of you heard. Right? The point of this passage is to say that if you're a Christian, you need to be incredibly emotionally fervent when it comes to following Jesus. And the thing that you need to know is that if you're not 100% in and totally sold out for Jesus, if you have any doubts in your life or any inconsistency, then you might as well be cold and be an atheist. There's no room for you in the middle. You're either all in, sold in for the doctrines and teachings of Jesus, or you're all out. There is no messy middle to be in. And while this perspective is common, it's intellectually lazy because it fails to actually take the Bible serious, to look at the actual context that Jesus is intentionally weaving into this letter to help them understand. He says right here, I know your deeds, which means what he's really talking about here in the context of hot water and cold water, each being used for intentional purposes, is that as a follower of Jesus, you were made to be productive and fruitful, both individually in your own personal life, in the life of the local church, and also in the world. He's calling out Christians in this context. Not that doubt, not that sometimes aren't always the most fervent, not that always show up on Sunday and maybe don't want to raise their hand during the music, but Christians who are okay to sit back and consume religious experiences, to claim the name of Jesus and not have that impact their life any other way. And so if you find yourself in the messy middle, I'm glad that you're here. You're welcome here at Grace. You would have been welcome in this church as well. If you find yourself in a spot where maybe you like Grace and you like this church and you're leaning in, but you're not quite yet convinced, I'm glad that you're here. I want to be really transparent. As a church, we're going to try to be as persuasive and effective as we can to win you over to following Jesus. We want you to follow Jesus with us. But you can take your time. You can doubt, you can question, and you can process through this decision, and hopefully one day you can become like us, to follow Jesus and become a productive contributor to what God is doing here at Grace and in the world around us. So he basically condemns them for this. He says, man, you don't have any form of life as following Jesus. You are a Christian in name, not in activity. And then he says this. He starts to unpack why that's the case. He diagnoses why they ended up where they're at. He says, you say, I'm rich. I've acquired wealth, and I don't need a thing. Grace, let's be honest. For many of us, this is our goal in life. We want to get to this level of financial independence. We want to get to a place where we're not dependent on anyone or anything. We talk about this. I want to get to a place financially where I'm not even dependent on my company or my industry or my job. We want to get to a place where the bank account is full, Hilton Head is booked, our kids' college fund is fully funded, and we got extra money in the bank. We can spend it where we want to spend it. We want to get here. This is our goal. And what Jesus is saying is this is your goal, Church of Laodicea. This is what you aim for. This is what you worked for. This is what you received. And then he continues. But this is not a good 3 letters right here. But means there's a difference between your scorecard and Jesus' scorecard. There's a difference between the goal that you've aimed for and the goal that Jesus is aiming you for. He's saying there's a disconnect. There's this widening gap between your life and the life of Jesus, that your ways no longer match the ways of Jesus. And he says this. He says, you don't realize that you are wretched and pitiful and poor and blind and naked. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm hoping that if I were to ever sit down with Jesus and we were having a conversation, right, these are not the ways that he would describe my life and my walk with him. This is not the adjectives that he would use to describe me as a pastor and a Christian. And here's what I know about the church in Laodicea. They didn't think that these were the words that described them. In many ways, what Jesus was saying to them is, man, you think that you're impressive, that your city's awesome, you're wretched. Man, you think that you're trendy because of your clothing and the economy that you have, and people look up to you, and that you're acceptable to the world around you because of how trendy and acceptable you are. He says, but you're naked. You think that you're rich because of your banking system and your prosperity and all that you've acquired and the financial independence that you set before you, but you're morally bankrupt. You think you're healthy because of the medical school that you have, but you're blind. He's literally letting them know that you have this whole thing, that you think that you've acquired success, that you have somehow arrived, that you have been everything that you wanted to be, that you and me are okay because you have this. And I want you to know that you can have this and have nothing. That your whole scorecard's broken. Your whole checklist is broken. And many of the church in Laodicea were like, but Jesus, I give, I serve, I show up, I raise my hand during worship. We're good, right? And Jesus says, no. You're wretched, you're poor, you're naked, and you're blind. And just like us, the thing in us that wants to say, no, that's not me, that may be somebody else, is evidence that we are self-deceived. And so Jesus gives a way forward. He starts to unpack what they need to understand. He says this. The next verse, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire so that you can become rich, and wear white clothes so that you can cover up your shameful nakedness, and salve to put on your eyes so that you can see. In many ways, what he's saying is you've built this target for your life that's completely independent of me. You can have these things and not have me. So he says, what I want you to do is come back to me. Build your life. Center your scorecard. Center your life. Center the direction that you're heading in your marriage and your career and your finances and your family to be centered on me. You're looking for comfort? I'll give you comfort. You're looking for satisfaction? I'll give you satisfaction. You're looking for peace? I'll give you true peace. You're looking for prosperity? I'll give you true and lasting prosperity. But in order to get this from me, you have to change your disposition from being one of, I'm successful, I'm independent, I'm good, to have a different perspective. He unpacks it. He says, to those whom I love, I rebuke and I discipline. So be earnest and repent. This is not this picture of a God who's looking down distantly on humanity, angry because they've somehow robbed him of this imperceptible idea of his glory. He says, those who I love, I rebuke. Which means that if you're a follower of Jesus, one of the best ways for us to receive the love of Jesus is to joyfully and humbly and eagerly receive the rebuke that Jesus brings to our attention. It's not something that should be avoided or we should be ashamed of or embarrassed of, but it's something that we should lean into, that we should glean and pull from. And then he says, man, be earnest and repent. Turn back to me. He continues talking in the next verse. He says, here I am. I stand at the door and knock. Which again gives us this different perspective, I think, that many of us have when we think of God, that when he rebukes us and he confronts us, that it's somehow a way to actually distance himself relationally. Because we do this. When we finally get to the place where we blow up at our spouse or our coworkers or our neighbors, and we finally let them know what we think, it's because we are intentionally creating a gap relationally. And what Jesus is saying is here is that he's rebuking, that he's confronting because he's leaning in. He's saying, I want you to eagerly and earnestly turn back to me. And the reason why he's saying that is because he's at the door, eagerly and earnestly leaning into us. He's only asking us to turn back to him because he's already and more intensely pursuing and searching us out. I'm at the door knocking. He wants back in. He's pleading with us. Let me back in. Be a part of my life. I want to be with you. Stop doing life on your own. Follow and trust me again. And then he continues unpacking this. If anyone has ears or hears my voice and opens a door, I will come in and eat with that person. I'll restore the relationship. I will come in and eat with that person and they with me. To the one who is victorious, I will give the right to sit with me on my throne, just as I was victorious and sat down with my Father on his throne. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. You know that you're in with somebody, right? When they get an extra concert ticket or they have an extra spot in their golf foursome, or they're going on a vacation and they need someone else to invite, and they invite you. You're like, I'm on their inner circle. Like, you know you're in with them because they're sharing what they love most with the people that they love most. We cannot miss this. What Jesus says here, to the one who's victorious, I will give the right to sit with me on my throne. That's a reference to his glory, his goodness, his greatness, the thing that he exists for. He wants to share with you and me. He literally is rebuking and leaning into these Christians because he says, I want you to have the best. The best that I have to offer is yours if you will just follow me. Friends, we should never take lightly the rebuke of Jesus, because the rebuke of Jesus always leads to our greatest possible blessing. He intends good for you more than you can intend for yourself. His designs and plans for your life are better than anything that you could create for yourself. His blessing for life is greater and more lasting and eternal than any blessing that we could come up with ourselves. And he wants to share it with you. That is his intent. If we have ears to hear and we understand and we receive the invitation that he has for us, which then begs the question, what is the invitation that he has for us? And the invitation that he has for us is this, that a Jesus-centered life is a Jesus-dependent life. A Jesus-centered life is a Jesus-dependent life. The problem with the church in Laodicea is they had moved past us. They had somehow thought that we've done our part. It's somebody else's turn. We've arrived. We're comfortable. We're independent. We don't need anything. They'd become independent of Jesus. They had drifted from it. Times were good, and they had drifted from faith and trust in Jesus. What we need to understand, and what Jesus is trying to help the church in Laodicea understand, is that if you are a Christian, you never graduate from dependence on Jesus. You actually graduate from independence of Jesus into dependence on Jesus. If you're a follower of Jesus, you never mature past dependence on Jesus. You mature into deeper dependence on Jesus. It's completely counterintuitive to the way that the rest of the world works and to the way that the rest of the world was created by God to work. God actually made it, right, so that as we become older and more mature, that we would become more independent in life, right? We shouldn't be in our 30s and 40s living in our parents' basement playing video games, right? That's not a good goal for our life, right? It's natural and normal that as we become teenagers and into our young adult years, that there is conflict that exists between us and our parents as we demonstrate the fact that we're trying to create our own boundaries, we're trying to create our own independence, right? And these battles show up all over the place. They show up from who we hang out with, the clothing that we wear, the music that we love that they hate. And these battles rage, right? Because what we're doing is we're demonstrating and fighting for our independence. We do this with our bosses. We get to a place where we fight for independence so they don't need to micromanage us, so that we can do the job on our own. But because Christianity is so counterintuitive and upside down from the world's perspective, rather than fighting for independence, the call that Jesus is giving to the church in Laodicea and the church here at Grace is to do the exact opposite. Rather than fighting and working towards independence, we actually fight for and work towards deeper dependence in Jesus. And in many ways, in this passage, there are three important ways that we're supposed to fight for dependence on Jesus. Because a Jesus-centered life is a Jesus-dependent life. And if I'm moved to a place where I've matured and I'm no longer dependent on Jesus, I'm no longer Jesus-centered in my life. So here's the first thing that we need to fight for that Jesus is writing to them, that we need to fix our scorecard. Right? They said, man, I don't need a thing. I'm good. Like, I've gotten to a place where I can pay my bills. I'm comfortable. Things are great. I don't need a thing. And Jesus is saying, that's the wrong scorecard that you want. He says, instead, I actually want you to come to me. I'll give you wealth. I'll give you success. I'll give you comfort. I'll give you peace. It's a completely different perspective. One of my favorite hobbies is golf. I'm not good at golf, but I love golf. And it's not uncommon that I'll go and I'll play with great golfers. And I'll come home and my wife will ask me, how's it going? Now just imagine with me, it was one of those days where we go out, I'm playing with great golfers, and I come home and I'm in pretty good spirits. And my wife says, hey, how did it go? How was golf? And I said, babe, you'll never believe it. Out of everybody on the golf course, I was the best. I had the highest score out of anyone playing. If you know anything about golf, you'd be like, bro, that's not how the sport's played. You don't understand how the scorecard works. You think you're winning, but you're actually losing. The score is to actually get the lowest score possible. And the scorecard of the Christian is to be the most dependent on Jesus, not the least dependent on Jesus. Here's the thing about scorecards. Scorecards always reveal what's sitting on the throne of our heart. If the thing sitting on the throne of your heart is finances, your scorecard will be your salary and your bank account and your 401k. If the thing sitting on the throne of your heart is your beauty, your scorecard is going to be the wrinkles around your eyes and your waistline. If the thing that's is sitting on the throne of your heart is your family or your kids, the scorecard will be around how peaceful and easygoing and fun life is with your kids and with your family. If the thing sitting on the throne of your heart is sex, the thing that's on your scorecard is going to be your sexuality, your identity, and your sexual exploits. But here's the thing that's true with these scorecards is every time we get to a place where we dethrone Jesus from the center and throne of our life, we have a tendency to replace him with ourselves. Because what happens when we look at our scorecards, if we're honest, our scorecard is about my convenience, my comfort, my glory, my prosperity, my fame. And we usurp Jesus on the throne of our hearts and we replace him with ourselves, which means the first thing that goes as we move away from Jesus is a scorecard that's centered on Jesus, his ways, his style, his things, and we replace him with ourselves, which ultimately means when our scorecard goes, our worship goes. One old pastor and theologian put it this way: when a man is impressed with himself, he never adores God. Our scorecards always reveal what we're impressed by. And if our scorecards are based around us, we'll never adore Jesus. We'll never worship him. We won't obey him. We won't live for him. Because really what we're doing is we're living for ourselves. We've created this counterfeit version of Christianity where we have this veneer of religious experiences, but on the core, it's all about us. First thing we need to do is fix our scorecard if we want to live a Jesus-centered life, which is a Jesus-dependent life. Because when that goes, everything goes. So we get that right, then we can move on to the second thing that we need. That we need to fight the lie. She says, turn back to me. Earnestly repent, which means turn away from the way that you're seeing the world, the way that you're doing things, and come to me. Let me lead you. Use my authority and my standards for your life, rather than your own. And the thing that's true about fighting a lie is that you can fight a lie on Monday and start believing it on Tuesday. And lies are most destructive when we're most unaware of them. And so the thing that we need to do is learn to see the lie and spot it. And one of the different ways that this lie shows up often is in our language and the way that we talk about and assess our life. We have this phrase in our culture, famous last words. And in 2000, I was looking at some famous last words, and the Blockbuster CEO said this: Netflix is a joke. No one will ever want to stop renting our VHS tapes. Right? I can't tell you how many bankers and investment brokers and people who were flipping houses right in 2008 said no one's ever lost their investment money on real estate. Or the millions of Americans in 2020 who said, it'll just be 2 weeks. We have this other version of famous last words. It usually is when they're famous last words, but they're also incredibly foolish and self-destructive. And it's when someone on social media says something along the lines of this: here, hold my beer. Because what they do is they say, here, hold my beer. I'm going to juggle some chainsaws. Here, hold my beer. I'm going to set off a bottle rocket in my pocket and see what happens. Here, hold my beer. I'm going to go wrestle that grizzly bear. The famous last words of every Christian is, I don't need. I don't need to pray. I don't need to be prayed for. I don't need to serve. I don't need to share my faith. I don't need to give. I don't need to go to church so often. I don't need. And just like every drunken fool almost kills himself and harms himself when he says, here, hold my beer, every Christian harms themselves when they start to think, I'm just fine. I don't need. We have to fight the lie. When we see it, we call it out. When we see ourselves telling ourselves, I'm fine, I don't need anything, my bank account's good. Lie! We think, man, life is good, I'm beautiful. Lie! We think, man, life at home is good, my 401k is good, my family's good, I like my job, I am good, I don't just need anything. Lie! That's not what you're made for. You're made for something greater. And if we don't call the lie out, we become unaware of that lie, and eventually that lie takes over our heart. And one day we wake up and we realize our scorecards change. Because our scorecards change, we're no longer living a Jesus-dependent life. And because we're not living a Jesus-dependent life, we're not living a Jesus God-centered life. We fix our scorecard. We fight the lie. And then thirdly, we get to a place where we do this. We need to focus on being fruitful. We need to focus on being fruitful. Remember, Jesus is using the illustration of hot and cold water, right? Which is all about this idea of usefulness. Hot water is used for comfort and for healing. Cold water is used for satisfaction and refreshment. And what he's telling these Christians is that your faith is not useful. It's not useful to the kingdom. It's not useful to you. It's not useful to the local church. It's not even useful to the world. It's just basically a name only. That Christians were made to be productive. We were made to be fruitful. We have been created and compelled and moved by God to make a contribution in our own life, in the life of other Christians, in the life of a local church, and in the world. We never should be on our own. When we do that, we fail to live up to our purpose and our calling in life. And we understand this intuitively in our culture because this idea of hot and cold, actually, this, again, the genius, this time-transcending truth applies to so many different areas. Like when you go home, right, there's a number of things in our life that should be hot or they should be cold, right? Your coffee should be hot, should be cold. Hot coffee, iced coffee, great. But the worst thing is when you go and you grab your coffee mug after you've been busy and you grab it and you put it to your lips and it's what? Lukewarm. It's not supposed to be that way. There's lots of other things, right? Ice cream is supposed to be cold. Maybe a little bit warm so it's soft but cold, right? What you don't want it to become is lukewarm because it becomes disgusting. Cheese, another great example. Cheese is great hot on your nachos and on your pizza. It's great cold on your sandwich. The worst thing is though when cheese gets lukewarm and sweaty. Ooh. Not supposed to be that way. Even just imagine with me, right? You go home, you're living up on life, you're playing frisbee with your kids, you roll your knee, it's messed up, you go to the doctor, and what does the doctor say? This is what I want you to do. Go home and I want you to put ice on it, put heat on it. Hot and cold, hot and cold, hot and cold, because it brings healing. It's purposeful, it's useful. What's the one thing he doesn't tell you to do? Just go sit down with Netflix and fan some lukewarm air over your knee. It might actually make it worse. If you're a follower of Jesus, you are made to be hot or cold. You're made to bring the refreshing and satisfying truth of Jesus to the world. You're meant to experience that yourself more personally and more profoundly. You're supposed to contribute to the healing and hopeful mission of the church and the world around you and in the local church. You're made to be fruitful. And when you're not, when you're comfortable just to sit back and consume this religious experience and raise your hand during worship and go home and just go about life like you normally were, you become lukewarm. Jesus is saying, I poured into your life blessing and hope and healing. Put it back in the world. Don't just bottle it up in yourself. When you do, your water becomes stagnant. And when your water becomes stagnant, your faith becomes putrid. And just like the putrid water will make someone sick, it will make you sick. The way that you focus on being fruitful is you commit to doing the ministry of Jesus in your life and in the world around you. Every time you follow Jesus and you focus on Jesus, you will become hot or cold when you do that. Right? If you decide, you know what, I'm going to serve Jesus because it'll bring you to the end of yourself. You come to the end and realize, I can't be smart enough, I can't be strong enough, I can't be good enough. You decide to share your faith with your friends and family, and what you realize is, I can't be smart enough to convince all of them. You decide to serve. And what you recognize is the more you serve, the more needs there exist in the church and in the world around you. And you realize, I can't meet all the needs that are in front of me. You decide you want to be generous, you want to give to Christmas in July and other areas. And you recognize you come to the end of your own financial resources. Your desire to be generous cannot be fulfilled because your resources aren't there. It brings you to the end of yourself. And every time you come to the end of yourself, it opens up an opportunity to be dependent on the power and work of Jesus in your life. One of the ways that you can measure your dependence is your prayerfulness. A lack of prayerfulness always reveals a heart that is independent of the work of Jesus. Always. Because one of the main motivators to pray is when you come to the end of yourself and you realize, I can't do this. I'm not smart enough. I'm not wise enough. The more mature you become as a follower of Jesus, the more you depend on Jesus. The more wise you become, the more you're dependent on the wisdom of Jesus. The more sacrificial you become, the more you are dependent on the model and example of Jesus being sacrificial. The more gracious you want to become, the more you are dependent on the graciousness of Jesus in your life. If you want to fight your sin, You will come to the end of yourself and you will fall on your knees. The road to following Jesus always leads a man or a woman to their knees. And if you're not praying, you're not dependent. A prayerless life is a life independent of Jesus. And we have to remember, how did the Laodicean church get there? It was through a period of success and comfort. Things were going well. That after a period, them like us, when things go well, we can start to drift and move away from dependence. Which means that there's something that we need to actually understand, because if you're honest right now, you think life is good, things are great, that should send something off in your mind to say, warning, red flag, I need to pay attention. And for many of us, we are so consumed with the desire to not fail and not mess up and not do things that we're just so focused on being successful that we miss out on the reality of this truth. And I want to encourage you to write this down. That we should fear success far more than we fear failure. The church in Laodicea was an incredible success, and this is how they got there. And then you look at the apostles, and they were incredible failures time and time and time again. And yet Jesus, in his faithful graciousness, time and time and time again, continued to work in their life and use them and shape them. So one of the reasons why I love and respect our elders, I love and respect Pastor Keith, is because they recognize that this is true for us as a church. We can fill buildings. We can meet budgets. We can baptize people, and if we're not careful, after a series and seasons of success, we can be like the church of Laodicea, where we have allowed success to squeeze out Jesus. This is a scary thing about the passage that we looked at that we didn't have time to talk about. It uses the illustration of Jesus at the door knocking. It's implying that this church had, over a series of seasons of success and comfort, had come to a place where Jesus was no longer in the walls of the church. He was on the outside knocking in. Think about it. These are men and women who had been converted by the Apostle Paul. Men and women who had witnessed and participated in miracles. Men and women who had seen God show up in amazing and powerful ways. Men and women who had talked to other men and women who had talked and touched the resurrected Savior. These men and women, over a period of success, had squeezed out Jesus from their church. If they can do it, we can do it. If they can do it, I can do it. Which means that when things are going well, we have to lean into this week's homework, because this week's homework is the first step that helps protect us and guide us in the right direction. And it's this. This week, I want you to review or rewrite your scorecard. I want you to review or rewrite your scorecard. Because maybe what you recognize is that you've dethroned Jesus on the heart of your life. He's no longer sitting on the throne of your heart. It's your beauty, it's your finances, it's your success, it's your family, it's your kids, it's your activities. Or maybe what you need to do is you do have the right scorecard, but you need to review it so that you can stay motivated, moving in the right direction. Because if we don't do this, if we don't get the habit of doing this, a scorecard is always the first thing that goes. And once the scorecard goes, we start buying the lie. Once we start buying the lie, we stop becoming fruitful and productive when it comes to following Jesus in our life. So this week, get some time away. Think, reflect, review, and maybe even rewrite your scorecard. Because if we don't, we could be just like the church of Laodicea. And if we do, we could avoid the faithlessness of Laodicea, and we could move towards the faithfulness that we've seen in the other churches in this series. And we can be a church that's healthy and productive and being used by God for many years and decades to come. And I hope that you will join us in reviewing and rewriting your scorecard so that we can be a church that collectively and individually is a church that's Jesus-centered, because we're living a Jesus-dependent life. Would you pray with me? Jesus, I recognize that the self-deception that existed in the church of Laodicea is one that we are all susceptible towards. God, I pray that if there are things in our life that are drawing us away from your truth, that are causing us to be self-deceived, God, would you take those things from us? If it causes our hearts to be broken, break our hearts. If it causes us to be frustrated, may we be frustrated. If it causes us to be disappointed, may we be disappointed. God, save us from ourselves. Save us from the desires that we have to deceive ourselves so that we can walk faithfully with you. We are our own greatest enemy when things are going well. Help us always and faithfully be more loyal to you than we are to our own independence. Help us see through the lies. Help us confront the realities, even when they're ugly in ourselves. God, help us be so impressed with the heart that you've demonstrated for us, that you are leaning in, that you've asked us to intensely turn from our sin to you because you have intensely turned to us. May you be our highest aim in life and our deepest joy. It's in your wonderful name that we pray. Amen.